So I'm honored and pleased to be able to start off the technical portion of this symposium. My talk will not be very technical. I want to focus on Jim's influence on me personally, and along the way I'll tell some anecdotes. It's been a long association. I co-authored my first paper with Jim in 1975, and most recently a two-part paper with John Platt and Jim in 2014. I have to say, there's been a number of other papers along the way that I've co-authored with Jim, and the papers that I haven't co-authored with him have also borne his great influence. It's been an exhilarating ride. It's a pleasure to work with someone who's so bright, so knowledgeable, and so generous with his ideas. I've often thought that if it paid better, I would have been happy to be a student of Jim's my entire career. But as Bernie Budiansky pointed out and John Shaw reiterated this morning, we're all students of Jim. So my story begins, again, as John noted, in 1971. I was an undergraduate at Brown, and I decided to concentrate in engineering mechanics. This was a new concentration which Jim had introduced, and I think I was the first participant. And so Jim became my undergraduate advisor. He quickly introduced me to what became themes of my research, fracture mechanics, dilation, pore fluid diffusion. Let me see, page down. Jim had published a paper at that time on the initiation and growth of shear bands. And one of the calculations he did in the paper was for the suction induced by a dilating end zone in a shear band that was propagating at a speed v. And he did this using a one-dimensional diffusion solution and came up with the maximum suction, which happened to be induced at the back of the end zone. And Jim asked me to look at what happens if the diffusion is not one-dimensional. Well, I managed to do this. I found the solution in Carslon-Jaeger and plotted up the results, and I won't go into any details here, but the result is that if the end zone length is about a few times larger than the diffusion length, the one-dimensional solution agreed very well. Now, also in that paper, Jim introduced a framework for treating the initiation of shear bands as a bifurcation from homogeneous deformation. That is to say, he asked the question, well, if the material is deforming homogeneously, when is the constituent relation such that you could have this bifurcation into an alternate form of deformation that corresponded to localization in a narrow band? And Jim set out the equations for this, but stopped short of evaluating it for any particular constitutive relation. And by this time I was a graduate student, and Jim asked me to look at this for a constitutive relation that was representative of soils and rocks. So the yield stress and shear increased with the mean normal stress, and the local slope of the yield surface was mu. The inelastic increment of dilation was another parameter, beta, times the inelastic increment of shear strain. And notably, this vector is not normal to the yield surface. And then there was a hardening modulus also involved, which is shown at the bottom. So I worked on this for a while and managed to come up with a expression for the critical hardening modulus at which this bifurcation could take place. And I went up to talk to Jim about it. And my expression was pretty messy and not terribly revealing. And Jim must have worked this out ahead of time because he pulled from his desk drawer a sheaf of these yellow pads that he liked to write on at that time. And his expression was this very neat one, which shows clearly that when beta is not equal to mu, so you have non-normality, that critical hardening modulus could be positive. Now, happily, we were able to rearrange my expression into the same form as his, and so I managed to get that right. So I went on and worked on some other aspects of this problem, and eventually the paper was submitted to the Journal of Mechanics and Physics of Solids. Jeffrey Hopkins was the editor at that time. He must have sent the reviews back by surface mail because they took forever. When they arrived, I excitedly went to the mailroom in Barris and Holly and retrieved them, opened them to find out the paper had been rejected. I was devastated. I sat in Barris and Holly for some time before I got up the courage to go up and tell Jim about it. Jim looked at the reviews and he blithely replied, "Oh, this is Rodney Hill." I can tell from the language, he obviously didn't read the paper. And so Jim suggested, well, why don't you draft a response to this and we'll resubmit it. So I did that, but that was really above my skill set at the time. And so Jim took over and he wrote what I considered a masterful letter. And I've saved a copy after all these years. I won't read it for interest of time, but on the one hand, he praised Rodney Hill for his seminal contributions. But on the other hand, he chastised the reviewer for not devoting enough time to reading the paper, that he didn't appreciate the contributions that it had made, and went on for 4 pages to rebut the various reviews. So Hopkins replied after receiving this that he had discussed it with the reviewer, who assured him that he had read the paper carefully, but under the circumstances, Hopkins would consider a revised version. So we did that, and eventually it was published. Let's see what else is there. Yes, let me. So somewhat later, really in the early 2000s, geologists and geophysics were noticing observations in both the laboratory and in the field of bands of localized compaction, which appeared to be forming perpendicular to the maximum compressive stress. And it turns out that for these more porous rocks, the yield surface turned over. So we have been thinking about this portion of the yield surface. I should put up my pointer here. We've been thinking about this portion of the yield surface, but for these porous rocks, it turned over. So that the local slope mu was negative, and since this vector pointed to the right, beta was also negative. And it turned out that if mu and beta were sufficiently negative, the critical orientation of the band was perpendicular to the maximum compressive stress. I should say here too that a correction of the original paper made by Perrine and LeBlanc in, I think, the early 90s pointed out an error which turned out to be critical in this interpretation. So this framework that Jim had really introduced nearly 30 years earlier turned out to be applicable also in this case of more porous rocks. So Kathleen Eisen and I wrote a paper adopting the original formulation, but adapting it to this more porous rocks. And then I wrote a few papers on that as well. I was also interested in the propagation of these bands, and I adapted Jim's calculation that went back to his J integral paper from 1968. And in that paper, he looked at a semi-infinite crack in an infinite strip that was held by fixed displacement at the boundaries. And he noted that the energy release was the difference between the strain energy in the slice far ahead of the tip and the slice far behind the tip. So I modified this for the compaction band case. And it turned out, again, that I worked with Kurt Sternloff here. And when Kurt put in numbers that were representative of his field site, this expression agreed with what people were finding in the laboratory, which was a little surprising. Yeah, so that calculation was also applied to compaction bands. Now, another observation which I had some interest in was due to Cheryl Temba, Teng Fong's student, and she noted that if you look at the midpoint thickness of these bands, which is a proxy for the inelastic compression against the band length, that relationship was very close to square root. And I wondered, well, what was the model that had this square root dependence? And so again, I went back to Jim's work. This something he taught me in fracture mechanics. Again, that was maybe 40 years before. This is a copy, which you probably can't see very well, of my notes from that course, in which he had talked about the propped open crack. So a crack which encloses a fixed amount of dislocation. Again, I adapted that to the compaction band case, and it does have this square root dependence. So this is nearly over 50 years that Jim has had a great influence on me. I've talked only about localization here, but he's had similar influence in other interests of mine, which are pore elasticity, cracks and dislocations in pore elastic materials, dilate and hardening, and so on. So I have been under his influence for this half century. And I just want to thank Jim for all his tutelage, inspiration, support, and friendship over all this time. And wish him happy birthday and best wishes to him and Renata for the future. Thank you.
Thanks, John.